happy to continue with the series of online discussions Get Real, organized by curatorial duo Talk, my colleague Anna Bitkina and myself, Maria Vates. So Talk is a curatorial duo, nomadic curatorial duo, as we call ourselves, that and our practice is kind of based and instigated by infiltrating into various social structures, institutions, and processes. And we try to draw attention to various emerging social and political issues, and try to look at, various social phenomena using a pretty complex approach. That's why most of our projects also are built on collaboration with experts from different disciplines. And this project is not an exclusion. So the series of discussion Get Real is a public program of our ongoing fifth season of our ongoing project Critical Mass, which is also called Get Real. And the idea of the season is to look at housing question from different perspectives and try to decolonize our knowledge of contemporary and historical housing processes. So Get Real is a series of discussion with participation of speakers from different fields. We're trying to take the housing question out of its sort of disciplinary isolation and take a look at it from different perspectives, including racial lens, gender lens, economic processes lens, political, and so on. And also together with our speakers and our audiences, we're working on sort of a decolonial way of describing and maybe develop kind of new apparatus for describing contemporary political reality and the influence of various factors related to the issue of housing and how it has been affecting our bodies, our consciousness, our health, and our experiences. And, while kind of looking at it from a different perspective, we also want to zoom into various often underrepresented cases of deprivation from housing, of deprivation from territories, on different clashes between governments, businesses, and activists, and also get different perspectives from sociology, anthropology, as well as art, filmmaking, and architecture. So in this program, we will also cover questions of alternative economic models and formats of cohabitation. We will also discuss accessibility to housing in connection to social status, class, ethnicity. And we talk about how marginalized groups are often deprived of their rights to housing, one of the crucial ones for the whole humanity. Definitely this theme is becoming more and more urgent with COVID pandemic and with the situation where people are losing housing and losing their ability to keep their homes. So I think there will be more and more topics and discussions throughout the series that will be becoming more and more urgent. And tonight we're talking to artist Ola Hassanain. And Anya, could you please introduce Ola?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. We are very pleased to meet our second guest, to welcome our second guest to be in the series of discussion. We started in December last year. Ola Hassanain is an artist from Sudan, based currently in Utrecht, the Netherlands. She also has a degree in architecture and cultural identity and globalization. These are fields that she's covering in her practice. Her artwork is informed by the cultural, political, and societal position of women in Khartoum, including her own experience and her family's diasporas. And she's also conducting Ph.D. in Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. And she was also fellow of BAK, Art Institution in Utrecht, Basis for Actuelle Kunst, where she did her fellowships and her family 2017, 2018. And she's also teaching in art school in Utrecht, the course Art in Context. And today she will be presenting her I would say, like in the center of our conversation will be her presentation called Out of Door Constellations. And she will be talking about the dynamic between state and people in the Sudanese context, the context of Khartoum, and how it delves into architecture, the physical environment, and urban-scape. So she will analyze and draw analysis from experiential narratives from different positions of women, and highlight certain political events. I also want to add that it's in the series of conversation about housing and new forms of coexistence. For us, it's very important to look at individual and collective experiences in order to conduct a deeper investigations and to draw a more precise descriptions of the consequences of global capitalism on peoples, on their lives, on their beliefs, on their bodies, and way of thinking and acting. So, Ola, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to basically just go through a narrative of tea ladies, and I'll try to weave that with some of the sort of textual layers that I've developed in terms of what, how we're bound to the physical environment around us, and how that existence within these enclosures and spaces also creates an open channel between us and the state. But it is, I basically suggest with this, and that the physical environment, of course, is what causes this channel to sort of deliver the state violence and state terror into our day-to-day lives. So I'm gonna attempt to sort of, talk, and then I'll try to evoke these moments of the narratives of the tea ladies' experiences in Khartoum in relation to how they've started to became a formal body of women cooperative unions in Khartoum. So basically, I've been working on inquiries about our built environment for quite a few years now. And I've been determined to sort of further understand how the built environment and geographic territories, the paradigms of the public and private, and what words like urbanization really mean, and which is central, of course, to the architectural practice, and of course to practices like urban design. But what urbanization really means also in relation to architecture. Through some of these inquiries around the built environment, I think it has emerged as a sanctioning process of state terror, as I just referred to, as I just sort of implied. And it allows for state terror to manifest as walls that contain every aspect of our lives. And in turn, it jeopardizes the quality of lives we lead. These inquiries have extended to questions about what part of architecture plays in imagining a future sort of outside of this terror. And and to where, under this current state of internalization and standardization of the education of architecture itself, would that question lead us? So, you know, questions like, well, a question like, can architecture be an extension of human ecology, for example, rather than sort of autonomous buildings and forms that create spaces as just mere outputs? I'm going to share my screen and just sort of open up to set sort of this mood of the what the dynamic between us and the state is like, really. So. Are you seeing the video, just to make sure?
Yeah, now we do.
Okay. Now, as you can see, this is a moment that was captured in demonstrations that took place in September in 2013, in which 200 people were killed in the first sort of flow of protests and demonstrations. And I also wanted people to kind of see that it captures a moment in a highway called Shara 16 or 16th Street in Khartoum. And this process of, like, you know, where bodies and, you know, bodies protesting a particular situation with the state are met with this violence, but also just a kind of a moment where there's a threshold that is being delivered to us, where we can't step out really out of what the state has kind of imagined for us, which is kind of a public space where, you know, that's supposedly ours, or we can all exist in, supposedly, that is meant to be with, you know, to sort of be always kind of go back to order, basically, cannot be disrupted with these type of gatherings and protests and whatnot. So I think that just shows us that there is this sort of a threshold where we can't step outside without kind of things kind of being asked to go back to order. And that, of course, entails this level of terror from the state. I'm going to delve into a conversation that I usually resort to in the that I usually resort. Excuse me, sorry. I think there's a problem with the. Yeah. Sorry. So I use this conversation between Sadiya Hartman and Fred Moten a lot, and it's titled "The Black Outdoors: Humanity's Future After Property and Possession," Humanity's Future, which was basically a series in Duke University. But I think I'll just pull out strands also from that conversation as I go. And throughout this, well, I can, of course, not fully unpack the idea of the outdoors just now, but I think the Black Outdoors in itself evokes an intriguing spatial connotation, because it talks about this outside And if you just now recall this kind of threshold, it's a calling towards, existing in that outside of the black outdoors. And since we architects have an intriguing position in the scheme of things, for we create enclosures, we materialize existing property relations, perpetuating forms of life that conform to an imaginary possession. Every urban space is either private property or belongs to the state, or / controlled by the state. Yet I think the architects should design or be able to deliver kind of ideas that go beyond property. And I kind of yearn to see what our surroundings would look like if that is actually worked towards. So now, especially today with the question of housing and rights for housing, I think it becomes crucial to examine the walls that we kind of, that are around us and we live within. So the walls which contain our lives, and try to learn to observe how, and I maybe can paraphrase here, maybe the shifting and transformed relations of power brought about through subordination of the emancipation, the control and domination of a Black population, and the persistent production of our collective subjectivities and aspirations for life outside of the state terror, and deliver it as irrational, marked as dangerous, and always entails obliteration of every embodiment of those callings for change from within these same walls. So the position of creating and thinking through an outdoors or an outside from within an enclosure leaves us always kind of peering at something which we have no point of contact. And in this sense, I guess the idea of thinking towards an outside is a helpful way or concept, because it becomes a way of seeing and doing, which I think can maybe encompass, other ways that are less easily defined. And if we further focus on architecture as one of the chief formalized tools of space making that creates the built environment, but also a main reflector of the state's imagination on people's everyday reality, we can further understand how its spaces will always remain implicated in processes of state terror. And now we just kind of look at this sort of outside. So what happens in this outside, and what is the outside to us today? And I think that this outside / outdoors, and I will be using them interchangeably, because I think one refers to the spatiality, and one kind of fuses the spatiality with these alternative philosophical stances. So the outdoor exists in relation to architecture, but does not necessarily need architecture to exist. And so I think that we mainly know our outside to be the public space. And if you can just recall the beginning with this video, what the public space also sort of witnesses, or what happens in the public space. And we know it to be our public space, our streets, and everything that kind of grows from within that, from ideas, practices, and meanings. And these are all kind of floating constellations of existing also in the outside. So using space and making space in geographies that have historically kind of led with agency against the different forms of state domination. So maybe I can repeat this again. So we mainly know our outside to be the public space or our streets and everything that kind of grows from within. But it is also the idea, it's also this growth that is from the ideas and practices and meanings of all these floating constellations of existing and space making, and the geographies that have historically led with agency against forms of state domination. So I thought that I'll start with this, now that we've touched upon this sort of outside that's bound by the state, but also, lives with others thing. The public space is not really something, is owned by us. But despite that, or maybe despite our also understanding that's pretty, Western focused liberal thought that we, it makes us believe that the public space is inclusive. The outsides we have now is not ours, technically. And so if what is deemed for the public as not ours, and how we are being framed in our call for rights of like housing and all of these services that are supposed to be delivered to the public, we are positioned by the state in a bigger picture. And sort of maybe now would be the moment of like, how we question how we can actually reflect our own aspirations into these calls, to want rights for housing, to want rights for this and that, but these different claims on the city or the urban-scape. So it becomes, I think, where we need to understand where we're positioned in the bigger picture, but also how we can deliver, reflect that again into legislations, so reflected into actual law, so that there can be a follow-up of actionability, stuff that can be done. So, and here I won't use the word policy. I don't understand it yet because I think it just hosts so many paradoxes. But anyway, we'll move over to a video that was actually made by SIHA, which is an gender-oriented NGO here in Sudan, in Khartoum. I'd like people to watch it. Can you see my screen? Oh, I'm sorry, I have to ask this question. والله طبعا يعني بيقولوا الشاي سميح وكذا. شنو الحاجة اللي بتميز شاي أميرة من الشاي عن ستات الشاي الثانيين؟ والله شاي أميرة طعمه ومذاقه جميل. Some of them are refugees from Ethiopia and Eritrea, but they are becoming accepted and they are actually part of the Sudanese culture that even the government cannot stop them. عشان يعني عملتي لك زباين وكده انت مرقت في الشارع تلقى رزقك في ناس بيجوكي كل يوم يا حليمه لا بيشربوا شاي كل يوم بيجوكي يشربوا شاي وبياكلوا لقيمات بيشربوا الشاي منو اللي بتعمل لك لقيمات؟ المرايسو يعني التحضير في البيت للشاي بيكون مرات بياخد وقت على حسب البهارات وعلى حسب الشغل يعني الحاجة بتكون تمام 100%. Years ago, tea ladies were only available in the morning. Now you can have a cup of tea or a cup of ginger flavored tea at 11 p.m. or like I'm doing now at 9 a.m. This is Reem reporting for African News. So tea ladies actually, this sort of attention to kind of the presence of tea ladies. It's a very, have become quite a growing kind of political entity in itself. And I think that the manner by which, you know, the things are set up, it's very makeshift, you know, as you saw from the TV, from the interview, sorry, that was on TV. It was you know, a small sort of setup where tea is given in the morning, and now it's a sort of on, you know, the whole day, and this is classified invisible labor, you know, there's an understanding of, like, you know, they can stay in certain corners for certain periods of time. And this kind of grew into also, of course, having a demand by the police or the state for certain permits to be taken, so that there's sort of a formalization or well, asking to a permission to sort of exist in that outside. Majority of tea ladies, and this is now, of course, currently changing. This interview was 10 years ago. That they used to be mainly, a big majority of them are from displaced because of conflict around Sudan. So they come to the center, and this becomes, you know, the street corners become a spot where they can make a living. Now, the public, we have something called the public law order, and that was a law that was actually quite vaguely, you know, delivered, and it's basically predominantly used to monitor sort of the use of the public space in general, but it has been definitely disproportionately deployed on tea ladies and other women around Khartoum. And the reason why I bring this up is that there's, you know, this kind of a gradual growing of, like, something that is a practice of invisible labor. It doesn't really register onto certain sort of formal settings, that grew into the state demanding certain permission, demanding certain sort of legal frame by which they can exist in certain corners, but then again also them being caught up in an enclosure formed by the public law order that again regulates them and regulates the use of public space in general. The working hours for a tea lady can be up to 17 hours a day, 15 hours a day. And this is something that has basically been quite, you know, something that demands some attention, because what do you do with this sort of experience where, you know, someone who's coming displaced is demanded to sort of forced into visibility through these permits and permissions, and at the same time always kind of raided under the guise of this public law order law. So the public law order kind of chased them around in a sense, and it was a moment where police can actually confiscate their material or their setups for tea. So I'm just gonna play another video.
هسه مثلا الشارع مع النظام العام الحاجات الجديدة وإذا مرة في الشارع بيبقى فيه رقم يعني هيزيتيشن يعني هي خايفة هي خايفة اليوم خايفين لأنه ممكن لأي سبب يخش.
Well, there is no, I don't see any video, unfortunately.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I see your icons on your, I see your screen, but not the video.
Not the video, okay, so maybe I can do that again. I'll try it again. Can you see it again? Can you see it now?
No, I don't see the video. Masha, do you see the video?
Okay, this is strange. Okay, I'll try it again. Okay, it seems like there's a problem with me sharing.
I mean, you could share, but the video is not starting. That's the thing.
Yeah. I'll try again, and then if it doesn't work, I could just
Yeah.
move on.
I think it's loading maybe, or
You see it now?
no. Can you open it on your computer or not? Is it opening on your computer?
Yeah, it's playing, so I don't know.
Okay, so I don't know, maybe it's some delay, but we see only the icons of videos, not the video itself.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, it seems there's an issue because it's supposed to start sharing it, but I can move on a little bit and maybe try it again maybe at the end. So I mean, I talk about the tea ladies because there's been a kind of gradual progression into the actual invisible labor to sort of go through a formalization language. And of course, you know, under this formalization that was led by a tea lady named Awadiya Koko, who eventually became the spokesperson for the community cooperative, women's cooperative, and that became, you know, the Women's Cooperative Union for tea ladies, and also became a, you know, that included other sellers of food and what has been sort of designated as invisible labor. She had this was sort of a formation that happened also in the sort of journey to sort of ask for certain rights and ask for certain protection also from police raids, you know, and so on and so forth. So of course this happened also under the guise that, you know, a certain formalization process also would guarantee certain rights because there would be an ability to register certain things. And this doesn't take away, of course, from the fact that there has been a lot of things that are achievable via this way of organizing, by the, you know, setting up this cooperative. But that also equally sort of delivered certain challenges as well. So we must, I think, I believe that the challenges were basically that this experience of sort of using the urban-scape temporarily to be able to, you know, live, you know, get your income and be able to live your life, that it created a certain enclosure where the state also was able to interfere via the urban-scape, you know, with actually, you know, police, you know, through the public law order that, you know, navigates public space and has control over public space. So we must think of these enclosures also that are created by the state and created by these notions of formalization, that are, the enclosures become normally sites for the, you know, the enclosure, which is basically, as we understand it physically, as a site for erecting buildings, is sort of no longer sort of singularly crafted. There's also the state, you know, dynamic, the political language and everything that is sort of within, you know, comes sort of with it as well. So it's also kind of a way of like thinking, if we open it up a bit, we think that we should be able to think that erecting buildings is no longer sort of a singular crafted enclosure, but it's also uniquely imagined by an architect, but it's also a kind of reproducing of certain products, right? or a reproducing a certain ideology. And that could be state ideology, but also just the sensibilities that come with that. So how people are read in the urban-scape, whether it be women or otherwise, you know, and how certain classes of people, you know, how the dispossessed people who are not really configured within this formality. So these reproducible products, let's say, are set within logistics, and they constitute a certain sort of infrastructure of understanding and reading physical space. And maybe now that we've kind of brought in the word infrastructure, I'd unpack the word infrastructure also from the writings of Keller Easterling in Extra Statecraft, The Power of Infrastructure or Space. So when we peer from the window in a city, you know, and you see the streets and the light posts and electric boxes and what is classified as infrastructure, it conjures up sort of connotations of transportation. We don't think of infrastructure in relation to what flows through infrastructure, you know? So now the word of infrastructure conjures up transportation, connectivity, communication, and services in general. We sometimes fail to see that we simultaneously live life also amidst this, you know, in these forms. And what would remind me of maybe what Sylvia Wynter calls these kind of floating archipelagos. And so that place contain geographies also, you know, from certain experiences. So they contain the geographies of those of us who live at the edges of shifting political world. In the same space also, as standards and ideas of control, and everything from technical objects to management styles. And these also constitute infrastructure as well. So far from hidden, infrastructure is now an overt point of contact and access between us all. The rules governing the space of everyday life flow through us, and they flow through us, and they're also within sort of these walls. And so they are within the physical environment as well. And so I ask again, what is actually happening outside? Yeah, and I propose here kind of like a pause, and just to sort of think about maybe thinking deeply about the local framing of these questions, and sort of to argue for sort of a fine-pointed scholarly interest, not particularly in the movement that is implied by infrastructure, but in our urban scapes today. And so the spaces of our houses, the spaces of housing, and yet to be designated houses, and their emplacement, their actual emplacement in urban scape, right? So I'm going to try sharing again, just so that I keep the flow of sort of visuals with the tea ladies. Okay, let's try this again. And let's hope it works. Do we see the video? Do you guys see the video or no?
No, we see.
No, I think you need to press on it twice so that it would start playing.
Okay. It already is playing, so I'm not sure why it doesn't show. Okay, maybe it's something with the video. Let's move to something else. So I'm just going to move to, sorry. I'm just going to move to Awadiya, who was who's the spokesperson of sort of the official representative of the Women's Cooperative Union. So I'm just going to, so in 2013, this particular formation happened of the tea ladies in Sudan. Do you guys see the? Yeah?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So we don't see the video. We've seen for a few seconds, but you want to try again, right?
No, that's okay. This is Awadia, and she had started this formation in 2016. It started in 2013, but she was awarded a prize of courage, International Women of Courage Award, and this is a photo of her by, where basically she's with the US Secretary of State then, John Kerry. And this marked a moment that basically, and I would quote her saying that, she was saying that the selling tea is a respectable occupation. And this was kind of, looked at also through a lot of these media outlets also as a sort of a moment of like acknowledgement and a moment of like, kind of full circle of formalization and, just eligibility, right? In terms of that it's now kind of, gotten international recognition. That this also is an eligibility for people who have been systemically excluded from certain rights to the city and how they use the public space, for their survival. This gradually became quite an interesting turning moment, right? Because a year after that, 2017, the state actually delivered a ban on selling tea at certain open spaces in Khartoum, so certain public spaces, so spaces that usually were occupied by or used by tea ladies. So one of them would be the Nile banks and whatnot. These were now, I think, completely fenced off to the public. And obviously there are no tea ladies. Before that, there was the ban of tea ladies, and now this is fenced off and sold probably to property sort of development people. So I'm gonna continue just talking about what this means, that and how I kind of was reading it, that it is definitely a moment where we kind of question, what kind of agency, when we are calling for certain rights and for certain claims on space in the urban-scape, what kind of agency is being activated, and are we leading with agency, or is the language itself kind of deactivating the potential that we have? It's a shame, of course, that in 2017, this ban happened, and there was a demonstration in front of the Friendship Hall in Khartoum, and the response to that demonstration was that actually Awadia and other activists that were supporting her were arrested. And so we see kind of again a full cycle of these conversations to kind of go and you face the state eventually, and once you face the state, it then kind of, there is a reset, where things are just met with this sort of complete blockade, right? So if I go back to what I was saying in terms of like, so with this type of information, like how is this, of use to someone who's, designing or making, buildings? But I think that, architects and, we follow these rules, right? So we follow kind of the state regulation also in a way to deliver more efficient, to deliver more efficient designs. And these buildings, I think, that are constructed according to sort of infrastructural layout, we see sort of these generic patterns of building that manifest the shifts of global market, which means that architecture also manifests infrastructure, and infrastructure is the built environment. Infrastructure space is the physical form in which we reside. It's in these walls. And from this perspective, I think when engaging with the physical space, we must accept that our geographies of struggle are inscribed into and bound up with the practices of state spatial domination. So it's interesting to see that this ban sort of removed the, tea ladies from the whole, from the whole sort of conversation, even after they have now kind of organized and are kind of a formal recognized entity. That the state channels are completely, the violence of the state basically just never stops, and so the exclusionary practice sort of continues or remains. So most of the, I'm thinking now if I should, So I'm just going to share one article that shows, especially now after the revolution, where there was a lot of sort of hope around, okay, that we can get certain strands of ontologies and sort of perspectives of people who were struggling in the past regime to push forth for certain rights and requests. Of course, parts of these rights were, of course, the right for housing, especially in the regions that were in conflict, displaced people here. And one was, of course, one of these spokespeople was again Awadia, who was speaking on behalf of the union for all the tea sellers and people who were selling also food. So she was actually banned from the conversation, banned from by the Transitionary Council in Sudan now. And this banning, I think, was a moment that was really, really telling also, because for me, sometimes I read it as like, okay, so there's now a representative, so you don't really have to go after the whole formation, because there is no, now you're kind of dealing with an entity, and so the banning of the spokesperson is also sort of a banning indirectly of what the requests of all the others are. And we're talking about more than 5,000 tea sellers just within Khartoum, right? So it's it's a huge thing. So I'm just gonna share again. So here it says that Awadia was actually, this is a picture that shows the leaders of the cooperative union. That basically she has accused the Transitional Council, she critiqued them for not delivering the certain help needed, especially at the stage where sort of reform was the biggest promise after the revolution, right? So again, she was banned, and I think that was just kind of a moment of yet again sort of this sort of blockade, and like how do you actually reflect your aspirations and calls for certain claims on the urban scape to the state if it completely sort of can actually kind of continue expelling you. But so yeah, it just becomes sort of, I think, a parallel of a conversation of this impossibility that seems to be inscribed into the urban scape itself. And so it kind of seeps through, of course, all the practices and who's creating the urban scape as is, and also the role of us as space makers in this situation. I'm just going to stop sharing. So even though this all implies that we are confined within these walls, we're not to be assumed as liberated subjects, right? It still puts our bodies and geography as part and parcel of spatial manifestation. So there is in fact a claim already on space that we have as being part of space. This draws attention to a passage in the direction of looking out towards an outside. We look directly at what is in our surroundings, right? And articulate ways of how to see what we see and how we can speak around new possibilities and reinventing properties of space production. So, you know, now that we kind of came across, we've introduced this sort of what space production is, and how can we sort of reinvent these properties of space production, right? So we have things that control that in the sense of regulation, state or building regulations and whatnot. And I think now the discrepancies in space production from this enclosure, which is property, has long been, I think, a point of frustration and contestation by you know, a lot of practitioners, you know, people who are urban planners, urban designers. But it also, I think, is also a moment that equally declares the professions involved, right, in space production, to declare them as sort of still not, well, that they cannot and will not mediate people's agency, basically, but rather consistently saturate the state's violence and the expulsions designed by the state. And I believe that the ability for space production to carry this dilemma and this paradox of it being something that is sort of, you know, that kind of delivers us shelter and whatnot, and also that can also be something that actually regulates, right? So I think that for it to carry this dilemma or paradox also informs us that there are continuous calls for, you know, the continuous calls now that we hear of deregulating of urban planning and architectural practice under this sort of understanding or claim that you know, this would actually sever our tie with the state and market. Is actually, you know, and limit the interference, you know, from the, okay, let me say it again. So we see these calls, I think, because the frustration is there, we see all these calls for deregulating as a solution, right? Deregulating urban planning, deregulating architecture, also practice, because people believe that this would, you know, sever the tie that we have with the state and market, right? So they believe that there will be limitation on this interference, this continuous sort of channel, open channel that the state has on us via the physical environment, right? So these calls claim that this would sever the tie from between the state and market and the process of space production. So I think this paradox also has led a whole argument of housing in many different contexts other than Khartoum. For example, like London, you know, with the deregulation requests, so that people can actually be, the urban planning deregulation requests so that people can be offered more and more housing, which allowed basically for people, you know, landlords of office buildings to turn the office buildings into housing units, and that basically can be done without, you know, a planning permission, and it's actually under the title of like permitted development, right? Which in turn, of course, led to a problem of quality of housing provided, the quality of housing provided, and also facilitated, of course, this excessive accumulation of wealth in certain pockets in the urban-scape, right? Without, of course, much commitment to the people, to the public itself, you know, to the people who are actually going to be using and living in these houses. And so, similarly, in Khartoum, which the regulation, let's say, or lack thereof of that regulation also demonstrated the same impact, but in a different way, right? So there's now a hyper finalization of land, for example. And so the notion of, for example, expansion of informal neighborhoods through occupation of public land or the illegal subdivision of private property in response to sort of a large-scale need for housing in a context where public housing programs have been comprehensively reduced. So there you see this massive conversion of spaces that were, you know, deemed sort of pre-urban, immediately, you know, kind of shift into becoming high value property and massive processes of conversion happening. And so you see that something about things seeming, you know, something seems to be kind of floating in a particular enclosure. So it has the same sort of result of expelling people or removing certain groups of people continuously from this so-called urbanization and development process and blah, 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 you know. So it seemed the so-called sort of call for regulating or deregulating bear similar fruit in terms of keeping space production sort of adhering to market and also, of course, basically possession and property. And so the so-called formal and informal way of doing things will always configure our lives and rights to that life in the function of networks of finance and of course, capital accumulation. And so I just sort of drew from this narrative, and I think I should stop now because I've gone over the time, that, you know, how do we factor in, you know, something, you know, and I gave the case study of the tea ladies because of the interesting progress that still kept it within, you know, the interesting and of course the very promising sort of organizing for certain rights, but that still kept it in the same loop, you know, and it started, and sometimes, to be honest, I don't even know, and of course this is definitely, not what I think is right, but I felt that level of invisibility did serve something to be under the radar of the state somehow. But of course it's not, because, you know, it also isn't the state of things, the state that we should sort of aspire to, because with that also comes, it makes you vulnerable. So it just becomes a question of like, what do we do? How do we envision outside of these enclosures? You know, I don't think there is any, I feel that, you know, talks of reform or like regulating or deregulating doesn't really get us anywhere in terms of spatial production. I think that the sort of control and domination of the state is already a spatial project. So if we don't develop spatial literacy, you know, that is to a certain degree and quite, you know, advanced, we won't be able to deliver sort of a spatial kind of project that's sort of countering that, you know. But anyway, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ola. I have a clarifying question. Because, you know, this kind of, I think street sellers are pretty widespread phenomena. And in Russia, for instance, this is mostly elderly women who grow things at their like little daches, and they sell self-made pickles or self-made jam, or, you know, things that they kind of self-produce. And for them, it's also this kind of strategy of survival, because this is in addition to their pension. Because it's very hard, especially if you're living alone, and it's very hard to support themselves for elderly people if they don't have a family. And actually, Asa Kamarov, a Russian-Dutch artist, did a project about these women in the second season of Critical Mass, and they were also under pretty harsh regulations at a certain point. from the state, because states saw this as unregulated economic activities that people are not supposed to perform. And of course, this was also an attempt to regulate public space and to not allow people to use public space in a way that state wouldn't want them to use. So economic reason was actually covering this initial way of controlling public space, and I think Russia in that respect may be similar to Khartoum, when the state thinks that the public space is something that belongs to the space but not the public. Mm-hmm. So in the case with tea ladies, was it mostly economic? Was it also political? And how government explained this, and did it even bother to explain that at all, their actions and their kind of, repressive mechanisms?
Mm-hmm. There was so many narratives that the government sort of put out there. One was like, okay, they can be, which were horrific, but like they can be like spreading disease, and they have to now show us. So it kind of gradually, the narrative also was kind of upped up, kind of umped a little bit every time. So, you have to, show them a card that you're kind of disease-free or whatever, that you're not like, spreading tuberculosis or whatever. So if they don't show certain cards, they get raided. Then it became a matter of like, this is not a respectable, occupation, which fed right into, of course, the rhetoric of public law order, which is this monitoring of use of space that is activated by, if the state representative deems the use of the space currently as a kind of, what was it called? Not that doesn't, kind of go against public morals, doesn't go through, against public morals, and these vague terminology, like who's the public, what morals are we talking about with a population this big. And so there was definitely kind of, you found out actually that through this rhetoric, you found out that also public space, or the definition of public space, was very linked to gender, and a sort of need to also look at gender meant that you're actually engaging with discourse that is about state preservation, not exactly about finding definitions of gender under the context of Khartoum and whatnot. So there was no, it was such a, every time there was a deviation, and there was I think maybe to the public or to the people, NGOs, because in Khartoum, I think NGOs deliver a lot of the civil service that the government should be providing. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't really have to say much about it, because there wouldn't, it's not possible to do much pushback that is outside of discursive work, so not much actionability. And it was all also, again, revolving around protesting and whatnot. So I think I also was just witnessing all this. It was also frustration of like, how do we even counter something? Like, how do we develop a language that would allow us to give us space to counter without being in this, needing to sort of assemble and then being vulnerable to state terror, and tea ladies were already in that space, completely vulnerable to state terror, and that, of course, also evokes so many things. I think the state just managed to deviate so many things, but it was also informative because it then drew a picture to what, what is really attached to women, and what is really attached to sort of a displaced woman also, yeah. I don't know if that went on a tangent there, but I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
I just want to make a note, and thank you very much for presentation, which through like such a urban phenomenon of Khartoum as tea ladies, you really managed to touch upon so many difficult layers connected to the organization of outdoors spatiality, really. And this is like it's a really actually difficult to grasp, right? Like put in words, in language, or to develop a certain method of how to see this outdoor space. And so kind of to earn, to gain, or to train this spatial literacy, which you really talking about, like, and until we see what is outdoor there, right? We will never understand what are those power structures that are really organize and control our lives. So this is kind of like a very interesting, like it seems like it's like those tea ladies that's so far away from saying like housing or architecture, but it is actually like the core, in a way, process through which we can really start unfolding it, the idea of analyzing this outdoor space, how it's and how we are actually excluded, right, from all these processes which we think we can control or be part of. So because those unseen properties, in a way, unseen processes as well, they're very important to like keep talking about. And I think you through your story about tea ladies, you really managed to somehow made those processes visible in a way, or at least not visible, but linguistically graspable, let's say it.
I mean, thank you. I'm glad that actually it kind of translated a bit. I mean, the fact that the practice of selling tea in itself, and now, of course, this whole kind of politically charged and sort of aura around it became something. It's something that is practiced technically outdoors, right? So you do see. You don't see just this infrastructure. This infrastructure is also has kind of bodily inscriptions. It has. It's inscribed in the body also. And that's why I wanted to, kind of highlight this point of like, just as much as that is exclusionary, it also means that we are part and parcel of space as well. That can't be tied off. And so whatever is inscribed to certain bodies, if they're part of capital, and I think that especially in the African continent, certain, we're part of a sort of a greater global capital, and these complexities have to be invited in, so that we're just able to whenever we look at the outside, let's say, or try to imagine something outside of it, this outdoors notion of an outdoors, it is aware. Not just aware, but just it has to have regard to these experiences. It cannot again be a tangent that does not, that is just, someone, kind of discussing around the charrette setting, certain people with tangible stakes. The other people also have stakes, and they should be let into the room as well. And the way it's done now is super exclusionary. And I think it relies so much on the visual that we're not, like, khalas, I think we're just not trained enough to see things. We need to see them manifest materially, and that becomes evidence of something. But a lot of what's going on isn't visible, A lot of what's actually controlling things or making these sort of horrific, certain experiences for certain people quite difficult, is unseen. It's really unseen. has nothing to do with materiality. You know?
Yeah.
So,
and it's yeah, and this is like, as you mentioned, it's like it's really how to see what are we surrounded with, right? Like how to because you know the project, I mean the series of this discussion, the project Critical Mass, is actually very much about human rights and the violation of power structure or corruption of our power structure. So we took this question of housing really as an entrance towards, as a complicated entrance towards those processes. And I guess it's very important. You mentioned it, and you said the architecture, architects, people that construct, and urbanists, people that construct our surroundings, also private spaces, they really should design. They should go. Their ideas of design should go very much beyond the property. And that's I guess, until I don't know, until this exactly is the not becoming a part of training for those architects, right? We will continue to be excluded. That's kind of a vicious circle. Right, so it's we will be continued to be part of this violation, right, of the violation of power and also violence of architecture itself.
Exactly, I do believe so, and I think that brings us back to the notion of the enclosure. And the enclosure really is this sort of this space of things being presented as impossible outside of it, you know. But again, we as space makers, I think we do occupy this interesting space because we do perceive of the outdoor before we start, you know, drawing out the enclosure, you know. And of course, this is debatable, and there's a lot of maybe Black scholars also that talk about, like, you know, what started first? You know, did the outdoor exist, you know, prior to, you know, that there is an outdoor already and we kind of just chip away at it, or do we create it via the process of design and you know, urban planning and whatnot? So and this is, of course, this is kind of a philosophical kind of notion, just to make us think about, well, we're people who actually operate from within the inside before, and then we create outsides, you know. And is that ability something that we can kind of build up on, but to kind of push it further? But also the notion of, like, well, when we look outside, you know, is the infrastructure something that is kind of laid out prior to? So the enclosure is something actually premised on a kind of bigger project of control, that it's actually the very last stage, you know, and what has been sort of preset or predetermined. We kind of still don't know what the signs of that are, what's the evidence of that are, or how it comes about. And I just, you know, speak also just from the position of like a, you know, a citizen, and what does that mean, you know, that proximity? Because I do think the state indexes, the sort of architecture indexes our proximity to the state, you know. So there's so much kind of going in and out of that conversation that it leaves me confused most of the time. And to be honest, sometimes I do reach a point where, like, maybe these professions need to go. But I don't know yet. You know, it's this kind of journey of just trying to understand how can we do this otherwise, if it's really something that kind of is if we're kind of product and output based like this, that means so much kind of went on and happened before us. You know, when you look at, like, we were talking earlier about, you know, the area of Leidscherain, you know, in Utrecht here, and how there was so much conversation with the community, and the municipality was so engaged and whatnot. But the deals and the decisions were already done.
Yeah.
So it was to me very interesting to see that this is the performative part of it, and we can link even that performative part to demonstration, right? To the demonstration that we've become so invested in this performative based political language that actually doesn't bear us any fruit. It actually is it's something that's very event based. And again, all of what happens and controls and fixes everything is not event based, you know? It's really not. It's stuff that's happening without us understanding. Yeah.
Simulation of inclusion, simulation of this process when some decision making is being based on, you know, vox populi sort of, and all these public hearings are mostly done just in order to kind of, you know, simulate this action of social justice. But of course, it's not happening. And in that respect, I think it's even more interesting how people find these loopholes to create new rights for themselves and to stop maybe this reproduction of kind of this mechanisms of space production, you know, and integrate themselves in certain kind of blind zones of public spaces and there exercise their new rights and slowly sort of reclaim this public space and reinvent certain rules. And these are small processes it's very difficult to implement these actions, but they happen kind of, you know, like the small lights of hope here and there. And especially I think now with the very strong processes of division in major cities, when we see how centers are becoming this luxurious urban parts and the outskirts are becoming poorer and poorer, this kind of actions that are aimed at disruption of this reproduction of this order, I think are very important to highlight and discuss, and also talk, maybe see if there are certain shared mechanisms that are being used that could be also applied in a variety of contexts. So this sharing of strategies, I think, would be very important also, and could also be part of this artistic activist practice.
True. Yeah. I agree, definitely.
But you know, the thing is that until we kind of force ourselves to be spatially literate, right, to really find time and space in our heads in order to really understand the complexity of these political processes, until we do that, I don't think like there is a hope for a better future. But it is extremely complicated process to be actually politically educated, right? To understand those the complexity of structures and to actually understand who is accountable for decision making. So that's kind of like what we try to do through like our practice, and we kind of try to also engage like-minded people into conversation about political realities and about those little nuances which have a big impact in the end on our lives. Yeah. Exactly. So Ola, thank you so much. It was extremely
thank you very much,
and we're really happy that finally we kind of got you in our radar, and I hope that's just a beginning for future maybe collaborations and for long conversations for sure, that hopefully will have also physical impact on in the environment which we live in. So thank you very much, and I would like, thank you very much again, and I would like to use the chance to also introduce our next speaker, who is going to be presenting as well, and has very close relationship with what you presented today. Although we'll be moving to the London context, and we're gonna be like more sort of, I guess, our analysis of public space and housing will be more visual, because we're going to analyze together with London-based artist Wilf Speller. We're going to analyze this computer-generated images of housing advertisement, and how those videos from different development companies are actually constructing or themselves are kind of representation of a neoliberal world, and how this imaginary housing, the kind of luxury real estate marketing, how it's actually manifested through this CGI, so this computer-generated images. So our next speaker, as I said, artist Wilf Speller, going to present on 28th of January, also at 5 o'clock Berlin time. And we would like to welcome you to join us next time. And thank you very much again.
Thank you for having
Thank you
me.
very much. Yeah.
Have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.